Alright, I've put it off for as long as I could. I'm finally doing it. My top 10 fantasy series of all time. Hello and welcome to my channel. In this video, I'm doing finally my top 10 fantasy series of all time. I've avoided doing this for so long because it's so hard to narrow it down. And also because of the fact that even just like this year, even just finishing toward the end of the year, I have read so many great things, and I've had several series that have been additions to the list. And then I'd look at some and I'd be like, well, if I make it today, like that's probably on the list, but I don't know if it belongs on the list. So I had some trouble finally doing it, but I decided to just go with it. I was just talking about it. I have a pretty good list, I think. I made a last minute change because the more I thought about it, I'm like, I'm going to go with this. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start with some honorable mentions, and then we're going to get into the actual top 10, going 10 to 1 in order of my favorite series. These will all be fantasy, and there are a couple of ground rules I have for doing a top 10. Number one, no unfinished series. This includes series that are unfinished publishing, so no Stormlight, or series that I have not finished, like Discworld. I haven't read all of Discworld yet. And, you know, I feel like with some things, like, you've probably read enough to kind of know how you're going to feel about a specific, like, series. But especially things that are still ongoing, even if I really like them, you're not going on the list. So that would include, too, like, Gentlemen Bastards, which is unfinished. So I can't really, you know, fully rate it, because I don't know. Maybe, like, the end will be amazing. Maybe the end won't be. I don't know. So I don't do those. Also, no cheating thing like The Cosmere or something like that. Because, like, that's completely cheating. That's, yeah, I know it's kind of like a whole connected series, but it's a bunch of different individual things. So those are kind of my ground rules. So let's start with some honorable mentions. Just books I want to shout out. Didn't quite make the top 10 list, but that I think are worth a read. We're also doing, I forgot to reference, back to a closer than normal view, because I don't want you to see all of the books I've taken off my shelves. I tried to make it like more discreet than I normally do. I'm sure if you like really analyze and pause, you can figure it out, but it won't take that long for you to find out on your own. First honorable mention is the Cycle of Fire trilogy by Janny Wurts. So this one is, it's a bit slow and it takes a bit to get where it's going, but it's a very classical feeling fantasy with some big twists, and was really enjoyable. And just the core concept, especially as you find more and more about what's going on, I found it really, really fascinating. So it doesn't crack the top 10, but something I do recommend for those who like classic fantasy with a twist, that kind of thing. Janny Wurts is also an author who has other books, including her Wars of Light and Shadow. Very well may appear on this list someday, but I still need to read. So I figured I'd give an honorable mention there. Next honorable mention is the Lycanius trilogy by James Islington, starting with The Shadow of What Was Lost. And this is a series, I really enjoyed the trilogy. I think it was a ton of fun. I definitely recommend people read it. It is, however, something that, you know, was written by a newer author, and it does show. There are some flaws with kind of like characters being a little bit shallow. Some other things just being a little bit muddled. It is really fun though, and I enjoyed it, but it didn't quite make it on the list for those reasons. And then the last honorable mention is The Demon Cycle by Peter V. Brett. Starts with The Warded Man. I really enjoyed this series. I think it's very underrated. A lot of people have problems with it for very legitimate reasons, but I thought it was a well-written series, and I thought the final book, the core, really stuck the landing, which I was surprised, because I did not think he was going to be able to end it in a satisfying way. Just because the way everything was set up, I'm like, how is this going to end well? And I liked the ending. So I think the only reason this got removed off of the actual list is because of how much I really did not like The Desert Prince. It just kind of soured my opinion, unfortunately, on the original series, because I did not like the follow-up. So I think that's probably why it fell off the list. So those are the honorable mentions. Let's get into the top 10. So right off the bat, I'm kind of breaking a rule because this is a combination. But I have to go with a combination of the Broken Empire trilogy and the Red Queen's War trilogy, which are in the same world and are happening around the same time. So that's kind of why. I feel like it's sort of cheating, but I'm going to include both, because these two, like, the Broken Empire trilogy introduces the world, and I feel like in some ways was a little more compelling. The Red Queen's War trilogy, though, I feel like was a lot better written overall, and you could just see Mark Lawrence getting more confident in his writing style, improving in his writing style. These two, I feel like, on their own, neither one would necessarily be on the list. Together, the two of them combined definitely belong on the list, and since it's still the same kind of continued story and series, I feel like that counts. So that's why I did it this way. But Prince of Thorns starts following Jorg of Ancraft, or it's, I don't know, people usually say Jorg. I always read it as Jorg. I don't know the audio, so that's why I still say it that way. Who's a really pretty terrible person, but it's his like quest for power, very much in the grimdark sphere. Red Queen's War happens around the same time, following a very different character in Jalin, who's more of the like get drunk and meet women and kind of that thing, and going on a very important mission as well. And it follows a very different style of narrative. This is a lot more humor, a lot less grim. But the two together just weave such an interesting picture of the world and what's going on, and it's something I really enjoyed overall. So that's going in for the 10 spot. All right, number 9. So number 9 is a series that, as I was reading it, I figured it would end up on this list. And it still is on the list. And the reason it's number 9, though, is because the last book I had some problems with, and I wasn't super happy the way it ended. But it still goes on the number 9 slot, is the Lightbringer series by Brent Weeks. I really enjoyed this series. I know a lot of people thought it was too convoluted and kind of fell off even before. And there are definitely some issues. It is not a perfect series. It has some flaws. I do think the characters are really good. The magic systems is one of the most like unique and expansive magic systems I've read. And that's really what pulled me in. I was so interested in the magic system, and then I ended up really enjoying the characters as well. The Burning White, I had some issues with the way it specifically ended. Some people, it did get kind of like overly convoluted and like have like an M. Night Shyamalan type twist, which was a little bit over the top, but it didn't ruin it for me. Neither did the ending either. There were just definitely some things I would have done differently with the ending, but this series just did a lot, and I thought was definitely a really fantastic series. So I do think it belongs on this list, but it sticks with number 9 because of some of the issues I had with it that keep it from moving up any higher on the list. So number 8, which this one might take people a little bit off guard. Number 8 is the Chronicles of Thomas Covenant the Unbeliever, the original trilogy. I still have not read the second trilogy or the final 4 books. I wanted to get to the second trilogy last year and I didn't. This series, though, it has really, really stuck with me quite a lot. I read, this was a roller coaster ride for me, because I read Lord Fal's Bane, and it took me a while to get used to the style, and I'm just like, what is going on here? The way it was done, it's Thomas Covenant's very abrasive in general, and the general story here, it's a portal fantasy where a man who suffers from leprosy finds himself in a magical world, where it's very vibrant and everything around him is full of life, and he feels like he's, this decaying husk, and so he rebels against it. He doesn't believe it's real, asks the philosophical questions like, can you be held responsible if you don't believe what's happening around you is real? The first book took some getting used to. The second book I thought was fantastic, and the third book I just felt was just darn near perfect. It just did exactly what it needed to do. It came back to the events of the first 2 books, but the first book especially, and really was showing the consequences of all of those actions, and was just handled so well. Plus the fact that the parts where Thomas is in the real world, I found almost more compelling than the fantasy aspects of them, which is a weird thing to say, but I loved those parts, and it was because of that. This isn't just a fantasy story; it's those real world elements are so vital to it as well. But really, this is one of those things. I randomly picked this up. I'd heard of Donaldson. I knew nothing really about this, and it took me a while to get to it, but I really, really enjoyed this series once I gave it a chance and got into it. And so I do think the 8th spot, especially for what it is, it's hard to put it higher because of what it is, despite how much I enjoyed it. So that's kind of where we stick there. So moving on then to number 7. So I said now Cosmere, and I meant it. I'm not going to just hop out and say the Cosmere, and I'm still not going to say Stormlight because it's not finished. But I felt like, considering how much I enjoy Brandon Sanderson, a Brandon Sanderson series probably needed to be on the list. The one I went with is Mistborn, the Era 1. Era 2 is not finished and probably wouldn't be on this list anyway, but Era 1 Mistborn was... the first Brandon Sanderson book I read was Warbreaker, and then I read Mistborn was the second thing I ever read. I have since reread with these beautiful hardcovers. I still really, really loved it. Mistborn was just kind of like the starting thing that really showed me what Sanderson was going to be able to do. Like, I really enjoyed Warbreaker, but Mistborn was taking that small story and then just elevating it higher and higher until it's on this massive, massive level with Hero of Ages, and just kind of opened up the doors for the Cosmere for me. And so that's why I think Mistborn, especially with reading it, and to me it holds up. I know not everybody loves Mistborn, but I really, really enjoyed it. You know, Stormlight will probably be on this list when it's done, or maybe like if the first sequence is a complete enough story, who knows? I've been known to bend the rules. But Mistborn as a completed trilogy is something I have read. I do think it holds up for me, just something I really enjoyed. This, of course, is the story of Vin and many others, and it starts off with they're basically like trying to overthrow the Lord Ruler, who's like the big bad who's won. It has Allomancy as the magic system that involves metals, just they're really kind of like complicated Brandon Sanderson magic systems that I really enjoy, and so I feel like it fits. I feel like most people know Mistborn, so I probably don't need to describe it that much, but that's going to hold up the 7th spot. So the 6th spot, which this one might be controversial for a couple of reasons, this 6th spot is where I decided to put Malazan, Book of the Fallen. Yes, I said Malazan. It's how it's pronounced according to me. And even though I know that's wrong, I can't. I read this so long before I ever heard anybody say it out loud. It was years ago. I can't take it out of my brain. But Malazan, I know a lot of people would probably put this higher, or other people might put it lower. I wanted to keep it right about the middle because of my complicated relationship with this book series. So I've read this series over a year. I've never struggled harder to finish a series of books in my entire life, because I usually wouldn't care for the first half of most of the books, and then I would be insanely hooked for the back half of almost every book. Like, I'd be like, I'm bored, or like, why are we seeing characters on a continent we've never heard of and not continuing the story at all? It's a series that's very complex. There's a lot of characters. There's a lot going on. There's a lot to keep track of. And the story is not very linear in a lot of ways either. So it just took me a long time. I wouldn't be into it. And then I ended up loving most of the books at the end, like the back half. Looking back, this is a fantastic series. What it accomplished is amazing. And it definitely deserves to be on the list. And like objectively on a list, it deserves to be on there. But because of the fact that it's just reading it, my personal enjoyment was not high enough for me to put it any higher on my list, personally, even though it is a fantastic series. I still need, I've been saying for a long time, but I need to at some point reread this series, preferably binging the series. I feel like that will help, and see how I feel about it. If I reread it and I'm still having a rough time, maybe it drops off the list or drops lower on the list. If I reread it and I'm like, okay, now that I've read the whole thing and rereading, I'm loving this even more, maybe it goes higher. That's where it is. I'm not even going to try and summarize this book because it's the plot is insane. It spans multiple continents, all kinds of characters, races of creatures, magical planes. There's so much going on. It's a huge series. There's a lot of stuff you can look up on it. It is a series that I think is very much not for everyone, but is a really fantastic series in its own right. All right, we are now done with the back half. So I commented in my top 10 books of the year when I was doing individual books. It was funny because once we got to like the highest ones, it's all like epic fantasy. Not surprising. This has mostly been epic fantasy besides, I mean, Thomas Covenant's like a portal fantasy, still probably counts, but I think pretty much everything here, for the most part, would fall under that grade. But we're getting into the back half and starting with 5 through 1 here. So this is going to be where the, I feel like 6 through 10, there might have been some surprises. I think most people will see coming what we're going to talk about here for the top 5. But we're starting out number 5 with Faithful and the Fallen. I almost dropped Ruin. I would have ruined it, wouldn't it? Bad pun, sorry. Faithful and the Fallen by John Gwynne. I have the last 2 books, Ruin and Wrath here. This was a series I'd heard a bit about, and I had planning to read it at some point, and I decided to bump it up when Andrew had told me just how good it was, and that it was one of his favorites. And I read it, and I absolutely loved this series. It has its flaws. It has a slow start. There were some issues with the ending, I think, but it was just such great classic fantasy. Like Ruin, they're like you'd have Ruin was my favorite book if you saw the other video, but you'd have the moments of like here comes the cavalry, like I don't even care, it's great, I'm so happy about it. The found family, the huge battles, the good versus evil. There are twists, but this is very much your classic fantasy with a lot of classic tropes, just done so well that it's great. It's not a bad thing necessarily to use tropes, but if you just use a ton of tropes and don't really do anything else, it can dampen my enjoyment of a book. Faithful in the Fallen did it really, really well. And this is the story of the good versus evil on the Banished Lands. Our main character, Corbin, and like people who are basically prophesized to be the bright star in the dark black sun, bright star, I think. It's been a little bit. But like good versus evil with a twist, like I said. Really great too. I think most people have probably heard of this at some point. I was late reading it. A lot of people have read it since me. But I think definitely deserves a spot here. It's just, it was just such a blast reading through. Just the blistering pace, so much action, so much great classic fantasy feel. So that's my number 5 slot. So then, and let me tell you, the top 5, but the top 4 especially, were really hard to place where I wanted to put them because so many great things in here. But I decided to, at number 4, put the Crown of Stars series by Kate Elliott. So I knew very early on that this was going to be on the list. I really enjoyed the first book. I loved the second book. The third book was like the one misstep. The third book of 7, I don't know if that was just that counts as the middle book, was the only one I really didn't like that much. But the rest of them I loved. I thought were fantastic. I binged the last like 3 books of this in a week and a half toward the end of December because I wanted to finish it. I knew it was going to be on this list. I just didn't know where. But I absolutely enjoyed the heck out of this series. It is also very classic fantasy, very slow burn. It focuses a ton on building out the world and really going from there. It starts on a pretty small level and then just like builds out till it's encompassing just a ridiculous amount all into it. And I thought it was a fantastic series. So I do have a Why You Should Read video on Crown of Stars that you can definitely check out. I'll make sure to link below if you want to find out more. So I won't like dig into it a ton, but it was always going to be on the list, and here is where I ended up putting it. So next up then for number 3, another series I was pretty sure was going to go on the list shortly after starting it. Memory Sauron Thorn by Tad Williams. I have the 3rd book, To Green Angel Tower. This series is another, this is classic fantasy. It's very classic fantasy, but with just unique elements and great characters and just a lot of just, it's classic fantasy done right. I love classic fantasy, and so it was no surprise that I enjoyed this, but this is one of those series I wish I would have read many years ago. I probably would have reread it by now. I probably would have already been reading the new Annnnd books. So great. I definitely want to check out more Tad Williams. I also have a Why You Should Read Memory Sauron Thorn video. But absolutely fantastic. Once again, this is another reason why I was so hesitant. Like, this is my number 3. My number 3, 4, and 5 I all read this year. And then number 8 and 9 and half of 10 I read the year before, mostly. So, like, Lightbringer might have been 2 years ago. Or a couple years ago. But anyway, but it's just like, I read so much of this within the last few years. So that's why I'm just like, I was reading so many great things. I didn't want to make my list. Of course, I could always change the list. This list probably will change a lot the more I read, because I've been reading so many great things. But Memory Sauron Thorn definitely deserves a spot on it. So number 2, and this is where I'm kind of combining again, because number 2, I had to make it a combination of the Farseer trilogy and the Tawny Man trilogy, both by Robin Hobb. Now, the reason is, Realm of the Elderlings is a series I have not finished. It is complete at this point. I haven't finished it, so I can't just like pick the whole series, because that'd be against the rule I said at the beginning. But Farseer honestly could be on the list on its own, and Tawny Man could be on the list on its own. But the Tawny Man trilogy is so amazing because of all of it does with touching on the Farseer trilogy as well as Live Ship Traders. So it's definitely this is the really the hallmark here. But without me loving Farseer so much and all it did for it, it wouldn't have quite been the same. But honestly, either one of those trilogies would have been, even if I'd only read those trilogies, and like hadn't read like the other books, would have been on the list. So, but you kind of have to read the book for this. That's why it's hard to pick. Realm of the Elderlings is something that I've said for a long time, that if it was going to take over the #1 spot, if anything ever was going to, it might be Realm of the Elderlings. Now, I'm reading the Rainwild Chronicles now, which I'm really not enjoying. So we'll have to see how that hurts the overall series. I've heard the last trilogy is amazing, but the first 9 books were really, really great. I really loved them, and Tawny Man was just fantastic. If you saw my top 10 books of the year, this was my #1 book of the year. So yeah, #1 book of the year. You can probably imagine the series is going to be on this list. Robin Hobb is most certainly one of my favorite authors. I do have a Why You Should Read Realm of the Elderlings video, which I made after reading the first 9. Because I was so sold at that point. Fool's Fate 2 actually does feel like an end of the series. The Rainwild Chronicles and then Fits in the Full Trilogy came later. So this, for a while, was the end. And so that's why I feel like it wouldn't necessarily be cheating to say the first 9. But it's the trilogies themselves, those especially, that really pushed it over. So that's where I went with it. So that was my #2 slot. Now, my #1 slot, I really don't think is going to surprise anyone. I have talked about it a ton. The symbols above me, I have this custom-made bookshelf all for it, but that is still The Wheel of Time by Robert Jordan. This series I've read so many times, and I've loved it all of the times. Yes, there's a slog in it, but this world and these characters and what Robert Jordan created is just stuck with me. For so long. Like I said, I've read it so many times. I used to be active in forums and I could never get enough Wheel of Time content. We're actually, this should come out before, doing a Wheel of Time reread on the Discord starting in February, which I'm very excited for as well. Actually, this probably, I don't know what day this video is coming out, but you can still jump in. If not, we're doing a reread. It's actually been a few years since I've done a reread, but I used to reread all the time. I love the Wheel of Time so much. Everything about it. I have not done a Why You Should Read Wheel of Time video because I felt like I'd talk for 2 hours. But Andrew actually has a fantastic Why You Should Read video that covers pretty much anything I would want to mention, so I will link that. But it's a great series. There are people who have a lot of complaints about it. Most of the complaints are very valid. The huge fans like to complain about it quite a lot as well. That is fair. I will admit that. It's fine. But this series just holds a place that nothing else has been able to uproot for me yet, and it's definitely still my favorite of all time. So there you have it. My first ever time actually making my top 10 fantasy series of all time list. Let me know in the comments what you think of my list. If there are books you would put differently, if there are books I have that you definitely wouldn't have in your list, or kind of like what your lists are as well. Also, feel free to come out to the Discord and post there. We've got some channels that you can use to do your top 10 lists. If you want to do yours as well, but don't have a channel, it's always really fun interacting that way. So you can check the link in the description for the Wizardly Doa Discord if you want to join in the conversation there or in the comments. It's great to interact, and we'd love to have you. Of course, give the video a like if you enjoyed it, and if you enjoy my content, make sure to subscribe.